The storm begins, the destruction of employment. Everything happened at once. On a morning that, at first glance, seemed like any other, the sun had barely begun to rise over the eastern hills when a series of messengers burst into Job's house, bringing with them increasingly cruel news. It was not a gradual tragedy, but a lightning attack on his life. The first messenger arrived, panting and trembling, bringing news that marauders had stolen Job's oxen and donkeys. The second messenger, with no time to waste, quickly spoke of the death of his servants, who were murdered by the edge of the sword, with indescribable violence. And before Job could digest the pain of that loss, another messenger appeared, covered in dust, bringing the worst news of all. Fire fell from heaven and consumed his sheep. Job barely had time to absorb the impact of these words when the last messenger appeared, with teary eyes and a look of absolute horror, who brought the cruelest phrase of all: their children, all dead. The house where they were celebrating collapsed. The tragedy was complete. In one fell swoop, Job had lost everything: his possessions, his servants, and most painfully, his beloved children. Now he was left with nothing. Everything he knew, everything he fought for, disappeared in a matter of minutes. But what seemed to be just the end was actually the beginning of one of the greatest spiritual mysteries ever recorded. Why would God allow such a righteous man so much suffering? What was behind this avalanche of pain and loss? What was really being tested? Job's journey is not a simple story of suffering. It is an existential question, a deep analysis of human faith, of how we react to the inexplicable. And the first lesson begins the moment you receive the worst possible news. It was not just a material or family loss that was at stake, but something bigger, something transcendental. Before the storm, Job's perfect life. Before this storm destroyed everything, Job was a man admired, respected, seen as a symbol of success and virtue. He had what everyone wanted: wealth, power, a united family, and prosperity. He was the most honest man in the East. The Bible tells us that he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and innumerable servants. His heart, however, was not in material riches, but in his posture before God. Job was a God-fearing man, someone who not only cared about his own righteousness, but also about the holiness of his children. He made sacrifices, offering burnt offerings to God, even without being sure that his children had sinned. His faith was an example of devotion, although it had no guarantee of divine protection. In this idyllic setting, a conversation took place in another dimension, in heaven. A heavenly meeting was taking place, and a dark figure, Satan, challenged Job's faithfulness. He claimed that Job was only faithful to God because his life was perfect. God then allowed him to be tested, to have everything taken away from him. But here, the central tension of the story arises. What if suffering is not a punishment, but a permission? What if, at worst, we are not being punished, but challenged to reveal something deeper about ourselves, something that only suffering can reveal? This is the real question that the story of Job presents to us. What happens when pain and suffering are not punishments, but opportunities to test our faith, to reach a deeper understanding of the divine? Job's suffering is not just a punishment, but a spiritual battlefield. The first reaction: faith in the midst of pain. The silence that followed the arrival of the last messenger was not just the absence of words, it was the absence of any meaning. Job stood paralyzed, trying to process the chaos that had just invaded his life. But he did not remain motionless for long. He prostrated himself. He tore his clothes, shaved his head, and threw himself on the ground, in a demonstration of deep mourning, but also in an attitude of surrender. And that's when he made a statement that will resonate throughout history. "Naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, the Lord took away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." This phrase was not a cry of revolt or questioning. It was an affirmation of faith in the midst of suffering. Job was not asking a question. He was making a declaration of trust in God, an unwavering trust that transcended circumstances. It was not just a passive acceptance, but an active choice to worship God, even in the midst of the deepest pain. But what Job didn't know, and neither did the public, was that the worst was yet to come. The new test, the imposition of meat. The battle was not over. Satan, dissatisfied with what had already happened, returned to the presence of God and once again challenged Job's faithfulness. Skin for skin, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But touch his bones and his flesh and see if he will not blaspheme you to your face. God once again allowed Satan to touch Job, but this time he would be touched on his own body. Job then suffered painful tumors from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. He, a rich and powerful man, was now disfigured, sitting on the ashes, with a shard of pottery in his hand, trying to ease the pain of his wounds. The image of Job was that of a completely broken man, stripped of everything. The physical pain was added to the emotional pain, and what was left of him seemed to be just a torn body. But Job's suffering did not end there. His wife, the woman who should be his greatest source of support, looked at him and said, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." Doubt now planted itself in his mind, and the viewer also began to wonder, how long will Job last? He had lost everything. His wealth, his children, his health, and now even his own wife were falling apart. But Job's response was even more impressive. He responded firmly, without resentment, without hatred. "We have received good from God, and should we not also receive evil?" He didn't understand what was happening, but his faith remained intact. The tension, however, continued to grow, and the question remained in the air: how long could he last? Job's friends, the internal conflict. Job's suffering would not go unnoticed. 3 friends arrived at his house: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They saw him from afar, but they couldn't even recognize the figure of Job. The silence was heavy. Job's pain was so deep that it seemed as if words no longer had power. When they finally started talking, what followed was an avalanche of arguments. Eliphaz, the first to speak, suggested that Job's suffering was a punishment for some hidden sin. Bildad based his speech on ancient traditions, saying that God does not reject the righteous. And Zophar, more impatient, suggested that Job repent. Their logic was simple. If there is suffering, there must be guilt. They tried to justify Job's pain with a simple and direct retributive theology. Suffering is always a punishment. But what they didn't understand, and the public did know, was that Job's pain was not a punishment. It was a test, and Job's suffering had nothing to do with sin, but with faith. The information the friends had was incorrect, but Job's pain intensified. He began to question everything, even his own existence. He was not rejecting God, but crying out for an explanation, hope in the midst of pain, Job's redeemer. With each word from his friends, Job's soul seemed to crack even more. He no longer understood the logic of his friends, who saw suffering as a punishment. He began to curse the day of his birth and ask, "Why was I born? Why is my life only anguish?" But in the midst of it all, a spark of hope appeared, even in the suffering. "I know that my Redeemer lives," he said, affirming his trust in God. This phrase, full of meaning, became a symbol of resistance. Job didn't know when or how, but he knew that somehow God would restore his life, even if he couldn't see it now. The last great mystery of Job's story would not be revealed by his friends, but by the direct intervention of God. The great loss, the first blow, the loss of material goods. Job is in his house, surrounded by servants and family, when one of his employees enters terrified. The man is breathless, his words barely coming out. "Sir, the Sabaeans, they stole everything, sir. The oxen, the sheep, and they killed the servants." An immediate commotion spreads throughout the room. Job's first question is simple. "What about my children?" Before any response comes, a second servant runs in. "Lord, the fire of God came down from heaven and consumed the sheep and the shepherds. All was lost." That first blow is devastating. The sound of the howling wind and the silence behind the servant's words create a feeling of incompleteness in the air, as if the tragedy was something incomprehensible. Why the fire of God? What is really happening? Doubts begin to invade the viewer's mind. Job stares into space without knowing how to react. In a brief moment of tension, he almost seems to disconnect from reality. His thoughts seem far away, but he holds his stance, still trying to process everything. The camera focuses on Job's expression, his eyes narrowing as he thinks, what else could happen? The second blow, the loss of children. Just as the servant finishes his last sentence, another arrives, panting and trembling. "Sir, there is something even worse. A strong wind, coming from the desert, blew down your children's house. They were gathered inside." The tension in the air is palpable. The tragedy now becomes personal. The pain on Job's face is more than sadness. It is absolute despair. He looks to the sky, searching for an explanation, but finds nothing. He falls to his knees, not only from the pain, but from a feeling of absolute helplessness. What happens when a person loses everything? How does this affect the human soul? At this point, the audience begins to question the forces acting on it and what it really means. The internal impact. Job's reaction. The camera begins to slowly zoom in on Job, who now lies on the ground, covered in ash, in a scene of total devastation. He murmurs something, perhaps words of despair or a prayer, but what he does next surprises everyone. He gets up, wipes his face and says, "Naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked I will return there." Here the narrative introduces one. Job's resilience. He does not fall into total despair. Even in the face of so much loss, he remains in a state of emotional sobriety. He still possesses an inner strength that no one expected. The idea begins to creep in that he may have a greater connection to something beyond pain. The inner scream. The search for meaning. Job now leaves his servants and family and heads to the field. The images of destruction around you, the piercing wind and the scattered bodies of animals create an apocalyptic scenario. It is in this scenario that he begins to reflect on the nature of his pain. As he looks toward the horizon, he sees a tree in the distance, which appears to be moving. Will it be a sign, something you still can't understand? Job is now on an internal search to understand what is happening to him. He looks at the sky, as if waiting for a divine response. The I question why. It resonates in the environment, and the public also begins to reflect. What does all this mean? Why do the forces seem to have turned against Job? What does destiny still have in store for you? The tension is palpable. He begins to search for some explanation in the scriptures, in his wife's words, and in his own heart. The feeling of deep loss is mixed with the search for meaning, and it is at that moment when the story is transformed. Pain becomes an existential question. He asks himself, should I curse the day of my birth, or is there something else to learn here? This moral dilemma puts the viewer in front of his own reflection. How do we face suffering? How do we react to extreme pain? These are issues that affect everyone, regardless of their religious beliefs. The tension grows as Job's suffering takes on greater and greater proportions. His fight is not only against external forces, but against his own spirit. What more does it take to break Job? Will he find peace, or will the temptation to give up be too strong? The arrival of friends, the beginning of a philosophical debate. When it seems like nothing else can happen, 3 of Job's friends arrive. Their pain is acknowledged, but it soon becomes clear that their speeches are not ones of consolation, but of judgment. They come with good intentions, but their words begin to raise doubts about the cause of Job's suffering. And are these friends really friends, or are they just there to question? How will his words further affect Job's suffering? What will his friends tell Job? Will they understand the depth of his pain, or will they simply push him to suffer more? God's response, the beginning of the debate with friends, the arrival of Eliphaz. The scene remains tense. Job is sitting on a pile of ashes, surrounded by a devastated landscape. His friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar arrive silently, visibly disturbed by Job's pain. The air is heavy, and the sound of their footsteps is the only audible sound. They look at him, and the silence between them is deep, until Eliphaz breaks the ice. Eliphaz begins to speak, and his words, though carefully spoken, carry a certain condemnation. Job, you have always been someone of great faith, someone who stood for justice and truth. What is wrong with you now? He attempts to provide an explanation, stating that suffering is often a direct consequence of sin. Job's frustration begins to grow. He can't understand how his friends, who know him so well, are now implying that he deserves this suffering. The question that remains is, why do these friends, who initially came to support him, start accusing him? Are they really trying to help, or is there something deeper behind their words? Job, with a tense tone of voice, responds to Eliphaz. I don't know what I did wrong. What did I do to deserve this? Where is the mistake? He raises his eyes to the sky as if waiting for an answer. The audience begins to wonder, will God really give Job an answer, or is he destined to live with this doubt? Bildad's point of view, the defense of divine justice. Bildad is next to speak, and his approach is even more direct. It defends the idea that God would never do something unjust. If you are suffering, then something is wrong with you, Job. God always rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. That is an immutable fact, he says with unwavering authority. Job's frustration intensifies as his friends continue to pressure him. He's already lost everything, his possessions, his children, his health, and now even his friends accuse him of failing in some way. He asks with a trembling voice, am I the only one to blame for all this evil? What could I have done to deserve this? Me? What Job's friends don't realize is that their approach only makes his pain deeper. Do they really have the answers, or are they simply trying to impose a rigid and impersonal view of human suffering? The public feels increasingly disconnected from Job's friends. They don't seem to understand the genuine pain of the man before them. What else do you need to do to be heard? Zophar, the approval of a divine punishment. Zophar, the third friend, is the most severe and direct in his words. He says bluntly, you are suffering because you deserve it. God does not punish without reason. Your guilt is too great, and the only way to find relief is to repent. His words are like a final blow. Instead of bringing comfort, it only increases Job's emotional burden. The idea that I must somehow be responsible for their pain is a breaking point. Job's reaction to these words is one of utter despair. He wonders aloud if there is anything he can do to redeem himself, or if his pain is simply endless punishment. What does God think of all this? What is Job's role in this endless suffering? Job now finds himself in a moral dilemma. Should he accept his friend's words and give in to the idea that his pain is deserved, or should he seek a deeper answer, perhaps one that challenges the traditional understanding of divine justice? Job's internal conflict increases. He asks himself, how long can I last? Am I really to blame? He wants a direct answer from God, but so far all he has received are accusations and empty advice. O clamor de Job, growing anguish, the search for answers. Job, now completely physically and emotionally exhausted, begins to question not only his friends, but also God himself. He gets up, walks across the devastated land, and looks at the sky with an expression of despair. God, where are you? Why have you abandoned me? Job's words are imbued with deep pain, as if he were speaking directly into the void. The camera follows his solitary walk through the desolate land, conveying the feeling that he is lost, aimless, adrift. This moment is crucial to understanding the depth of Job's suffering. Their anguish is palpable, and the audience feels this visceral pain. The question hanging in the air is, will God speak? Is Job ready to hear the truth, no matter how painful it may be? Job's despair, the silent scream. In a moment of great intensity, Job throws himself to the ground and cries, "Why was I born? To see this endless suffering? If I really am so guilty, why didn't death take me? Why continue living in this pain?" Job's cry echoes in the silence of the desert. What is God thinking about all this? Are you listening to Job's cry? Or will you remain silent? The suspense intensifies as Job's pain reaches its peak. The tension is unbearable. What will happen next? Will God intervene and answer Job's cry? God's response, the absence of God. After Job's intense moments of anguish and questioning, silence once again takes over the scene. His friends remain silent about the depth of Job's suffering, but what really marks this silence is the absence of God. Job is completely alone in his pain, and the absence of a direct response from God begins to become psychological torture. He had already become a different man, more distressed and tired than ever, but what hurts him most now is the heavenly silence. The lack of response, however, creates a palpable suspense. Will God manifest himself, or will you remain silent for all eternity? The audience begins to sense Job's growing hopelessness. He wonders why God has abandoned him. The pacing of this part of the story is crucial to the climax, as it heightens the tension of doubt and existential emptiness. What motivated God's silence? Why don't you respond to the cries of a man who has been faithful all his life? The manifestation of God. Finally, after long days of silence, God responds. The camera shows fury in the sky, a storm approaching quickly. Thunder roars and winds begin to rise, bringing with them a feeling of absolute power. Job looks to the horizon and sees the divine manifestation, with lightning streaking across the sky and a booming voice echoing through the storm. Where were you when I founded the earth? Where were you when I created the world? The scene is great, cinematic. The voice of God is deep and imposing. The greatness of his presence is impossible to ignore, and the suspense reaches its peak. God's answer does not come with a direct explanation of Job's suffering, but rather with a series of questions that defy human understanding. God does not justify Job's pain, but invites him to contemplate the greatness of the universe and the limited understanding that human beings have of their creation. The audience, like Job, is now faced with the immeasurable power and wisdom of God. What will you learn from this? What does God want to convey to Job with these challenging questions? How will Job react to this revelation? The great truth, the revelation of God. God continues his questions, revealing the immensity of his creation and the mysteries it contains. He questions Job about the origin of the stars, the seas, animals, and all of nature, showing him that creation is much greater than the human capacity to understand. God does not directly explain Job's pain, but invites him to perceive the greatness of life and creation in all its complexity. What does this mean for Job? How will he face the fact that the answer he sought will not be a clear justification? of human suffering, but rather an invitation to humility before the greatness of God. God's response is a real plot twist. The tension begins to dissipate, but a new question arises. Can Job, given everything he has heard, find peace in his suffering? Job's repentance and surrender. Job, faced with the greatness and wisdom of God, feels profound humility. He who until then considered himself sane now understands that his vision of suffering and pain was limited. God's words make him repent, not of something he has done wrong, but of not having understood the complexity of his creation and his justice. Job falls before God and says, "I spoke things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, things I did not know." Rhythm and emotional control. This is Job's moment of emotional redemption. The tension built up throughout his search for answers dissolves in this moment of surrender, and the audience feels the relief that comes with acceptance. What does this mean for us? Are we also facing our pain and doubts with the same humility? As Job, the big question is, how can we learn to accept answers that we cannot understand? The moment Job surrenders, a feeling of peace begins to take over his soul. But what will happen to him now? Will God really change your situation, or does God's true answer lie in something even greater than you could ever imagine? The end of work, restoration and lessons from suffering, restoration of employment. After the encounter with God, the narrative reaches a turning point. Job's pain does not go away immediately, but his perception changes. God, in his infinite mercy, begins to restore what Job had lost. She is given back her possessions, has new children, and regains her health. Restoration is not immediate, but Job's reward comes over time, demonstrating that true internal transformation is more important than external rewards. Job's true lesson is not in the material things he lost or gained, but in what he learned about the greatness of God. He understood that despite all suffering, true peace only comes through acceptance of divine sovereignty. The purpose of suffering. Job, now restored and with new vision, looks at his life and realizes that suffering has a greater purpose. The pain he experienced was not a punishment, but a journey of spiritual transformation. The bottom line is that while we may not understand everything that happens in our lives, we must trust that there is something bigger at play. True wisdom comes from accepting our limitations and seeking a deeper understanding of life and God. The video ends with a powerful message. Suffering may be incomprehensible, but it is through it that we often find our true strength. How do you, looking, face your own challenges? The story of Job teaches us that true peace comes from accepting what we cannot control and trusting in something greater. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Leave in the comments how you face life's challenges and if you also learned any lessons from the story of Job. Stay tuned for more powerful stories that can transform your perspective on life and faith.